Guys, what's going on? Welcome to Cereal at Midnight. My name is Heath, and I am joined by my friend Vanessa for a conversation about pre-code cinema. Vanessa, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to be back.
When we talk about pre-code, what are we talking about?
So basically, pre-code means any film produced in the US from late 1927, when talkies first emerged, to mid 1934. So any American film produced and released during that time period, that's essentially what pre-code means.
So over the course of this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what pre-codes are, what maybe some recommendations are, what some of the characteristics of them are, but this is not, listen guys, this is not a college level course. This is just a conversation between two friends who are discovering pre-codes ourselves and wanted to talk about it. So what's the best place for us to start? Maybe to say, like, what's a code? What do we mean by the code?
So, first, when I got into classic film, I had no idea that the pre-code classification even existed. All I knew was that I loved movies from the 1930s. That was my favorite film decade for like the longest time. But I didn't know what pre-code was until I actually started reading books about classic film and learning more about that era and filmmaking history. And then I kept coming across the term pre-code. I'm like, what is that? But then I found out it's starting from the talkie period. So The Jazz Singer was the first full-length feature film that featured audible dialogue. So the whole film wasn't sound, just portions of the film were. So from that film, from the release of The Jazz Singer in, I believe it was October 1927 to mid 1934, all those films that came out before the strict enforcement of the production code, the motion picture production code. And that came about basically because there was so much vice and crime going on in Hollywood within the 1920s leading into the 30s that audiences were like, what's going on over there? Like, what is happening? Because you had all of these popular on-screen personalities getting involved in sex crimes, murders, drug overdoses. And there's three key events, I guess you could say, that led to the creation of the production code. The first one was arguably Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle, who was an extremely popular silent film comedian. Everyone loved him. Families loved him. Even kids would go to his films to watch him. And he was ultimately charged with the rape and murder of a young woman by the name of Virginia Rappe. So that was the first event in Hollywood where audiences were shocked, because here you see on screen in his films a very jolly, happy man, but then he's being accused of the rape and murder of a young woman. And then after that, I think a few months after that, you had the still unsolved murder of motion picture director William Desmond Taylor. So, I mean, this all happened within months of each other. And then you have film stars dying of drug overdoses, like, what was his name? Wallace Reed died of a drug overdose, and Olive Thomas also died, but her death from drugs was considered accidental. She may not have known that she was ingesting drugs. But regardless, movie audiences and a lot of Catholic church groups became incensed because they didn't want their children and their families being exposed to this level of violence and crime when they went to the movies. They didn't want their kids showing up to a Fatty Arbuckle picture and then coming home and reading in the paper that he had allegedly raped and murdered some young woman. And you may not think that these church groups had a lot of power in Hollywood, but when they protested and when they said, no, we refuse to watch this movie, we're not coming to watch this movie, they had a lot of power because there were a lot of states within the US where Catholic churches and even Protestant churches, they had a lot of say.
You're talking about this, I'm thinking about Kevin Smith's Dogma from the late 90s, and I was like, oh, we lived this. How many times have we lived this? So one of the things that we like about these movies that I noticed that PreCode cinema is gaining momentum. It's becoming this, maybe it's the next wave of the cinephile, obsession. They're getting very popular. And it's because we're discovering that these movies are so powerful, they're so relevant, they have the things that we don't traditionally associate with, quote, old movies. Realizing that a lot of people watching this video might think that something from 1980 is an old movie, but we're talking about like really old. These older movies have so much charm and power, and they are naughty, and they are they're alive. The people are flawed, and they are not always great people. And I wanted to talk about that. Do you have any thoughts about that? Just the appeal of those early 30s movies?
I think for modern audiences, the appeal is it's exactly what you said. We're not accustomed to seeing such naughty, salacious content in old black and white movies. So when, let's say, a casual movie viewer sits down to watch a PreCode, they may not know what the term PreCode means, just like I didn't know what it meant until I read up on it. They could sit down and watch, for instance, Red-Headed Woman that came out in 1932, starring Jean Harlow and Chester Morris. They could watch that film and go, holy cow, what year was this movie made? Because there's so much in your face sex and innuendo and violence and vice in that movie that like the casual moviegoer will be absolutely shocked. And that's one of the things I love when I hear people say that they're discovering PreCodes for themselves and just they can't believe what they're watching. And that to me makes it so exciting, because that once their attention is captured, they're going to go back and watch more. So it's not going to just stop at one movie. They're going to continue on and on. And I think that's precisely what's happening now, because if you're on Twitter, let's say, and you mention PreCode, you'll get like 50 responses from people, because everyone is discovering PreCodes for themselves now. And that's absolutely wonderful.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the before we move into how it changed. I think it would be a good idea here to talk about maybe some of the things that we like about PreCode, some of the actors, maybe some recommendations, like some of our first experiences. I'll tell you, one of my first experiences with a PreCode, and I didn't even know what it was at the time, but it was on probably Turner Classic Movies, Big City Blues, and it's got Joan Blondell in it and Humphrey Bogart in a very early. It might have even been his debut. I can't remember, but I think it's 1932. But I just remember Joan Blondell walks into this room. She's got this tight dress on, and they're like looking at her butt as she walks away. And they're like, well, what did you look at the movement on that? Or something like that. And I was like, what? It was like, it blew the walls of my mind off. I was like, I didn't know they could do that. And then you start to discover other things. And, like I'm thinking like Scarface. For people that think that, the old Scarface movie had Al Pacino in it. No, there's an older Scarface movie. And it's every bit as dark and as depraved as the Pacino version. And I'm specifically thinking of some of the early horror movies and what they could get away with. I mean, something like Mystery of the Wax Museum. You've got, I was talking to C. Courtney Joyner about some stuff recently. He was like, there's a character in there that's on heroin. He's doing
Yes, there's so much drug depiction in PreCode cinema that audiences are totally shocked. And I think that's one of the key reasons why audiences of the day, so I'm talking about audiences of the early 1930s, they were also shocked because they had never seen this kind of material shown on screen before. And you have to remember that when people went to the movies, they took their children with them, because in the dawn of Hollywood, so when movies first started coming out in the 19-teens, it was very family focused, just like vaudeville was, just like Broadway was. Families went to these sources of entertainment together as a group. So in the early 30s, when you're starting to see alcoholism, drug addiction, rape, and violence on screen, that's what kicked off this whole strict enforcement of the production code. And another reason why actually that the production code happened was because when movies, in this era of filmmaking, there were more movie theaters in the United States and Canada than there were banks. So that's how much power the studios and Hollywood in general held. So when you had the movie studios moving from making silent movies to now talkies, that was an immensely expensive experiment. So some studios even believed that talkies were just a fad, that they were going to continue on making silent films. And actually MGM, one of the biggest, arguably the biggest studio in Hollywood, they were the last ones to go fully talkie. They were producing silent films right up until like 1930, which was unheard of then, because if you consider The Jazz Singer came out in 27 from Warner Brothers, MGM was late to the boat. So that's very unlike them. So you had all these movie studios who owned the movie theaters. Most of the movie theaters were owned by the studios, having to convert their movie theaters from showing silent films to now sound, where they had to install all the speakers and all the technical equipment to show sound pictures. That was immensely expensive. So movie studios thought, okay, how do we make that money back? Well, let's show really exciting, taboo, demented stuff on screen, and that'll bring people in and we'll make that money back that we spent on all this equipment. We'll shorten the run times of these movies. That's why so many pre-codes are even less than an hour long, to I'd say 90 minutes. Not all of them are. There are some pre-codes that are longer than others, but they shortened the run times on these films so that they could show more in a day. Like, let's crank out as many as we can. Let's host as many screenings as we can to make this money back. And they just kept going and going. And you see these films from the 1930s, even like musicals, the Busby Berkeley backstage musicals, 42nd Street, Gold Diggers of 1933, Footlight Parade. There's like nudity in them. And then audiences just got to the point where like, yeah, you say that you implemented this code, but where is it? We don't see it. There's so much crap on screen that our families are getting subjected to. And then the Hollywood studios are like, okay, you know what? We got to start enforcing this code. And that happened in July 1934. So anything produced in the United States after July 1934, there's a huge difference in tone, style, and what you see on screen. It's censored.
It's interesting because you'll find exceptions. Have you ever seen Dodsworth?
Yes.
It's got a lot of things that you would not expect from a code-approved movie in it. I think it's got nudity in it, if I remember correctly. But what changes? We're talking about how they're, okay, you can't keep doing this. So what happened? What were the changes that were implemented?
So basically, Will Hayes, the production code, technically on paper, it's known as the Motion Picture Production Code, but it's referred to by various other names like the Hayes Code and the Breen Code. No matter what name you call it, it's all the same code. So don't become confused and say, well, why is this code different from this code? It's all the same. It's just known by different names. So the Motion Picture Production Code, Will Hayes was appointed president of this code, and I want to get this right, so I'm going to read it off my notes, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America. So Will Hayes was the president, and he then appointed Joseph Breen as the enforcer of this code in Hollywood. So it was Breen's job to make sure that any motion picture produced in America between 1934 and on met the strict guidelines of the production code. And if a movie did not meet those guidelines, it was not issued a passing certificate. So if you watch a film that was released post July 1934, you will see in the opening credits, usually at the bottom, it says this motion picture was issued this passing certificate from the motion picture production code, something along those lines. And you'll see a certificate number. So if your motion picture did not meet those guidelines, it was not issued a certificate and it could not be released for consumption. A film like you mentioned, Dodsworth, I mean, that film had infidelity in it, adultery. So technically that was part of the code's guidelines saying you can't show that in motion pictures, but somehow it was passed and it went through. So sometimes you have instances in which, salacious material did squeak past the code and was issued a certificate. There are some instances of that, but the majority, you can plainly see that anything post July 1934 was censored.
And you can see the effects on the movies. Listen, I love the 30s. The 30s are one of my favorite decades of cinema.
Mine as well.
But you can see the toll that was... I realize I'm speaking about this as if it's a negative thing. Do you see that the code was a negative thing, or do you view it as maybe a necessary implementation to stop pandemonium?
I certainly don't see it as a positive thing. I view it as a negative thing only because I don't believe in censoring the arts. Mm-hmm. And many people don't. Yeah. However, I think that there were certain advantages to it in that once July 1934 came about and the code was strictly enforced, that kind of caused directors, producers, writers to rethink everything and come up with new ideas. So in that aspect, I think it did create a sort of need for more experimentation, more creativity, more ways of storytelling. But in all, I don't view it as a positive thing.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a fair point, that when you throw up boundaries on something, you have to be creative to get around those boundaries. We saw a lot of that. That was a good thing. But we have a list here of the code don'ts, the be carefuls, things like that. And I mean, it's like everything that makes movies human and relatable, everything that would make a character, flawed in an approachable way and not this distant, polished, larger than life figure. Do you want to talk about some of the don'ts?
Yeah, sure. Did you want to read some, and then I'll read some of the be carefuls?
So, pointed profanity by either title or lip. This includes the word God, Lord, Jesus, etc. The way they get around some of it, like hell and stuff, the way they'll get around some of this, I was watching a movie recently, and it was like, he told you where to go, and you know where it was, or something like that. Like they say he told you to go to, and they'll be like, no, that's enough, I got it, or something like that. So they get right up to the point, and then they pull back, and that was enough. It was like, well, technically, we got by the code. Suggestive nudity, in fact or in silhouette, any lecherous or licentious notice thereof by any characters in the picture.
I'm laughing because there's so many pre-codes that immediately spring to mind that had that in it. And it's like, okay, now just all that stopped.
Ridicule of the clergy, willful offense to any nation, race, or creed. Those are the don'ts. Then the be carefuls, the use of the flag, international relations, that's crazy to me, but the use of firearms, which is, I mean, there go your gangster movies, there go...
I mean, the thing is I don't think the use of firearms ever really stopped, because you have tons of gangster movies that were produced post 1934, which is like, I mean, they were being produced right up until the mid 1940s. So I don't know what happened with that one. Maybe they just crossed that one off.
But you know what they would do is they would add these, well, they would always have, the gangster movies always had some sort of a morality to them.
Yes.
It got so much more heavy-handed in the era of the code, where they would, this is the era where there'd be like this horrible gunfight or something, and then there's like this massacre, and then someone turns to the other person and like, wow, that was really rough. What do you say we go for a sarsaparilla, eh? And they're like, yeah, bah, 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 bah. And then it's like the end, and you're like, whoa. Whereas earlier than that, they'd just like have the down ending. You'd have the downbeat ending, and that was okay. But then they had to.
Well, the thing is, they couldn't go much further, so they had to cut the scene somewhere.
Oh my goodness! Some of the other be carefuls: theft, robbery, safe cracking. So we've added basically all crime to the list now. Be careful with crime, brutality, impossible gruesomeness, technique of committing murder by whatever method. So again, there go your crimes and your mystery. I mean, they still had them, but actual hangings or electrocutions as legal punishment for crime.
And that happened a lot in early 1930s cinema, where you did see criminals being electrocuted. So those scenes were all cut. Or if they weren't cut, they were implied. Yeah. So what you had is someone being electrocuted in the chair in prison, but the camera was focused on some other person in the room, let's say. So you couldn't, it was happening off screen, basically. So you know it was happening, you just aren't looking directly at it. So again, there are ways they got around this list of be carefuls.
I'm going to jump ahead to some of the other ones. Let's see. Man and woman in bed together. That's a big one, because that would follow through. I was watching a movie last night, and there was a married couple, and they're in two separate beds. And I'm like, it's so unrealistic. I mean, maybe it's realistic for some people, but...
And that carried straight over to TV. So when you have shows like I Love Lucy, for instance, they're in separate beds. Yeah.
Use of drugs, surgical operations, excessive or lustful kissing, particularly when one character or the other is a heavy.
Yes. Yeah.
You want to talk about some assumptions about PreCode films?
Sure. So I sent out a call out, and I believe Heath did as well. So I sent my call out on Twitter saying, send me your assumptions about PreCode cinema. And I got a lot of responses, and actually some of them were quite thoughtful, I want to say. So some people came back with, these movies are static with no camera movement, and they're not wrong. So a lot of cinema from the early 1930s, very early. So like I'm talking about 29, 30, 31. This is when studios are still getting used to producing sound motion pictures. So a lot of films, particularly from MGM, almost look like they were filming a stage play. So you have one set, you have all the furniture there, and you have a cast of characters. And you can play that the camera never moves. It just focuses on this one set, and you have all the actors in front of the camera just walking from one point to another on the set, hitting their marks and saying their lines. So not all PreCodes are like that, thank God, but there are some. So I mean, it's not an incorrect assumption at all. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then there's another one, they're too long and risky to invest 2 hours in. That's not true, because there are many PreCodes. I would say the majority of PreCode films that were produced are 60 to 80 minutes long. So you could easily knock one or two, or even three out in an afternoon. Some of the films were less than an hour long. So don't think that because it's an old black and white movie, it's going to be 2 hours, 2+ hours long. They're not. The majority of them were short, because again, movie studios wanted to knock out as much material as they could in order to make money.
Yeah, absolutely.
The one that I really want to touch on is strong female roles don't exist in PreCode films. 100% incorrect. If anything, I think this person was probably talking about old black and white movies in general, where a lot of the female roles were just like housewives or secretaries, or just very, very neutered on-screen female roles. Whereas in PreCodes, you have movies like Babyface starring Barbara Stanwyck, Red-Headed Woman with Jean Harlow, Red Dust with Jean Harlow. These are very strong, powerful female roles where I think a lot of people, if they sat down to watch these movies, they would be shocked at how these women were portrayed and created on screen. So don't believe that assumption. Don't make that stop you from watching these films if you think that, females were basically dolls on screen. No, 100% wrong.
It's even like a whole trope, like the feisty 30s woman who just does not accept the boundaries of the status that she's given, and it's a whole subgenre of these films. You want to talk about the last one?
No LGBTQ plus representation in pre-code films. Hollywood had to be careful there. Mm-hmm. So there were, if you watch pre-code films, there were a lot of character actors, not leading characters. I'm talking about the character actors that were maybe third or fourth billed on the credits. So you had many of them, they weren't outwardly presented as homosexual or lesbian, but it's implied in the film. But again, Hollywood had to be very careful here because at the time, homosexuality was still illegal in many, many states, if not all the states, and same in Canada too. I'm Canadian, so so yes, I think homosexuality was decriminalized in the US in 2003. So this is very recent history here. So in the pre-code era, yes, you could imply that someone was gay, but you could not openly show them as such. You had to be very careful because, again, that was still considered illegal.
You want to move into some recommendations or just talk about some of the things that we enjoy, some of our personal favorites from what we're talking about?
Well, what's your favorite pre-code? You had mentioned it earlier.
Oh, did I? What did I say?
No, you mentioned the first pre-code you saw. So do you have a favorite?
No, I don't have I have a lot that I like. I have a hard time with favorites, but I will say I love those Universal monster movies, especially the early ones. Frankenstein is an incredible movie. Dracula's good. I like Dracula. Dracula's like, well, I respect Dracula, but Frankenstein has the stuff that I really connect with in it. And then by the time of Bride of Frankenstein, they're doing something else. But then we have on our list Freaks. Todd Browning's Freaks it's an amazing movie, and so it's real life. I mean, they're circus freaks. That's the plot of the story. Is it's a lot of circus freaks. So we're talking about people with deformities and physical challenges. And there's a scene that takes place in the rain. It is one of the most shocking things. I mean, I don't know if it's shocking now, but when you see it, if you see it, you just don't expect it. And so I have a lot of respect for Freaks because Todd Browning is exploiting these people, but it doesn't feel disrespectful to them. And let's be honest, he gave them jobs, right? They're on screen, they're being who they are. So that's one that I like a lot.
That's a great example.
White Zombie, Bela Lugosi. I really like
yes. That one. Yeah. You know what? I think horror, if you're a horror fan and you want to get into watching classic horror, I say start with the pre-code horror films. Mm-hmm. They're absolutely fantastic. And like Heath said, White Zombie, Freaks, Frankenstein, amazing films. Also, The Black Cat from 1934. And that movie was released 2 months before the production code was strictly enforced. If that had been released after, there's no way we would have gotten that film in its current condition. It would have either been cut to shreds because there's so much in that film that would have had to be edited out. Yeah. Or, it just wouldn't have been released at all.
And there's a Satanist in the movie and someone gets skinned alive in the movie. Yeah. It's rough, but it's great.
Oh, it's fantastic. It's one of my favorite early horror films. It is fantastic. So yes, if you're a horror fan, check out pre-code horror movies because there's nothing else like them.
Yeah. What are some of your favorites? Go ahead.
My absolute favorite pre-code is 3 on a Match. And that movie stars Joan Blondell, like every good pre-code does. I swear to God, Joan Blondell is in every single pre-code film. So Joan Blondell, Bette Davis, and Anne Dvorak, they play 3 women, obviously. So we first meet them as school-age children, and then we see them later on once they become young adults and then adult women. And oh my God, I don't want to spoil anything. It's a very short movie. I think it's just an hour and 3 minutes, but my God, is there a lot of storytelling in that film. There's drug addiction, there's kidnapping, there's infidelity. That PreCode has so much in it, and it's so beautifully told on screen. And Anne Dvorak gives the performance, I think, of her career. She was absolutely fantastic. And the first time I watched that film, I was like, okay, ding, 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 my new favorite PreCode. And it's not changed since. That movie to me is unbeatable. I think a lot of people say the quintessential PreCodes are films like Babyface and Redheaded Woman and The Divorcee. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with those films. They're fantastic examples of the genre or the classification. But Three on a Match for me is just tops. Nothing beats that one for me.
I've never seen it, so I'm going to have to track it down. And is it on disc?
It is on disc. It's so Warner Brothers and TCM a few years ago, they produced a line called Forbidden Hollywood. And I think there were something like 10 to 12 volumes, if I'm not mistaken. Three on a Match is in volume 2. So it's available on DVD. I don't think it's come out on Blu-ray yet, but I would love to see that get a Blu-ray remaster or restoration. And TCM shows it every so often. So you can find it on TCM. But oh my God, yeah, Heath, you got to watch that movie.
Okay. I will report back. This is a good lead in to talking about where people can find PreCodes, because as I kind of started at the beginning of the video, there's so much access to this stuff now in a way that there hadn't necessarily been. I bought this book. Vanessa, I bought this book recently, and it's talking about forgotten movies that deserve to be, I think it's called Forgotten Movies to be Remembered, or Forgotten Movies to Remember. And it's so interesting how many of the forgotten movies are now celebrated in the 30 to 40 years since that book was written. We really are living in a renaissance for rediscovery of a lot of these things because of the DVD era. I know a lot of people are like, well, DVDs are gross, but they got so much stuff back into availability. And yes. And now the Blu-ray situation as well. You got Warner Archive. So many. Kino Lorber puts out like 4 PreCodes a month right now. There's so much access to this stuff in a way that we never really had before. Where else can people find some of these movies?
If you are subscribed to the Criterion channel, they often, I think late last year, they had a whole PreCode spotlight program. And now this year they did, I think they did a special programming for Mae West. And they currently have, I think, 14 films of Jean Harlow's. They did Paul Muni. So Criterion channel is a great way or place to stream PreCode films. And I believe actually they had Three on a Match last year. And that was shocking to me because that was the first time I saw a network outside of TCM promoting and talking about that film, because it's not very well known. So, and a lot of these PreCode films are part of the public domain now, so you can watch them for free on YouTube or archive.org. You can find them in a lot of places. And also, they're so popular now. Everyone wants to discover them. So, yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah, this is my movie dad comment for this video, is that, if you're a high definition only person, you're missing out on a lot. I don't know that being a cinephile, being someone who's really interested in movies, can be a high definition snob. We love it when we have the option for that, but there's thousands, potentially tens of thousands of movies you will never see if you're not if you're only looking at 4K or Blu-ray. So there's a huge world out there, and this stuff absolutely holds up if you go in with the right expectations and allow the movies, if you watch them on their terms and not your terms. They have so much to say about the times that we live in, and movies are time capsules. They really are. They are the closest we can get to time travel. We can see how people lived, dressed, the things they were concerned about. We have visual record, and these PreCode movies are so relatable and engaging, and this is just the beginning of a much larger conversation that we'll continue to have. But I want to thank you, Vanessa, for being here to talk about PreCodes with me. Where can people keep up to date with what you're doing and what's going on with you?
You can find me on Twitter. So my handle is at Vanessa Buttino. And yeah, I'm always on there. I'm happy to talk about films, pulp culture, anything with you guys. And I always love when I get tweets from Heath's audience. Oh, it's fantastic because we all have similar interests, and it's wonderful to get to talk to so many of you through that.
That's great. And your love for this stuff really comes through. You have such a passion for it, and you live this every day. And so I'm so thankful that you sat down and talked to me about this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Yes. Classic cinema is a huge passion for me. I'm no expert, certainly no expert. There's so much more for me to learn, but I love doing it. I love learning new things about it every day.
The secret is you never finish learning. You never arrive at the destination. You never become the expert. You're always a student. And on that note, guys, watch some of these movies. Let us know what you think. I want to continue the conversation in the comments below so we can recommend some movies to each other. We've only just touched the tip of the iceberg here. What are some of your recommendations, some of your favorites? Let's continue that conversation in the comments below. Vanessa, thank you again for being here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, I love it. I love every time I'm here. Thank you.
And guys, thank you. We'll just continue. We'll keep it going. So take care. And until next time, we will catch you later. Bye.